it's very hard to write a poem that someone comes back to that doesn't have stakes.
The worst thing that it could be is not even memorized. Like,
Yeah.
I don't even remember this experience. They have this idea that they're great writers. They're like, I just know I'm an incredible writer, and I just need to get out there and do it. And the thing that I'm trying to tell you is that, like,
if I were teaching stakes, I might start off with something simple, like you're running late for work, or you're running late for a job interview. What are the implications of that? And then even just like kind of like just thinking about like the chain of events that comes after that. So like for instance, you're running late for a job. So what happens? You potentially get fired. What happens if you get fired? Well, you might not get your paycheck. What happens if you don't get your like kind of like and just like going down that road, because then you can start understanding what's at stake, what are the implications and things like that. And then from there you can kind of build that into poems. So like for instance, you probably want to start with like poems that are already done, you know, um already published, and then kind of see, okay, what's the situation that's happening to this speaker? What's happens because of this? What happens because of that? What happens because, and then kind of go into that same sort of logic. Like if someone had just walked me through that sooner, it would have been very impactful for me. And I think even if I were just starting, like, yeah, I mean, metaphor is obviously a crucial thing, but that having that sort of logic and walkthrough would have been very, very valuable for me, because I wasn't even considering like, so what? I wasn't even considering who cares. I was just writing poems like, oh, that's a really nice poem. But like, oh, but what's the impact of this for speaker, for reader? It was like, oh, I didn't think of that.
do you feel like everybody's poetry requires? I can
Okay.
think of quite a lot of poems that have zero stakes to them. I mean, even having stakes that are like only real stakes to a a person
Hmm.
or a character or what have you in your poem
Hmm.
are still stakes.
Hmm.
So like that, like those aren't to diminish those stakes. Which is just to say that, yeah, there's a lot of poems that don't carry stakes at all, but are still good poems. I would, you know what I'm saying. So like, do you think that
Hmm.
that's how it trickle again? Because I think
Hmm.
stakes are a like stakes through metaphor. You can
You can, for
communicate stakes
sure.
through other things. So do you think that that is something that, which again, I do think that it's like an incredibly useful, and I think it gives a level of investment into the poem,
Hmm.
because now I'm like, okay, you set the scene. Now I have to understand
Hmm.
what decisions actually mean in this
Hmm.
space, or what decisions the person, the character that I'm
Hmm.
following or what
Hmm.
have you, which feels to me like, more of the basics of like just general storytelling. Because if I'm telling a story and I don't have any stakes, then it's probably not a story.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, are there good poems out there that don't have stakes? Yes. My I'm not interested in good poems anymore. I'm interested.
You had that right. You read that right, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, at Diverses,
I'm,
you heard it here from Jeff first. He says, I am no longer interested in good poems anymore.
I'm not. I'm interested in the great poems that you want to come
Oh,
back to over and over and over again. If I write a poem and someone's just like, "Oh, that's nice," and then they forget that poem, a day later, 2 days later, a week later. Personally, and this is my own bias, this is my own focus on my own work. I have failed that poem. That poem has not
mm.
done. I don't want that poem to be considered finished until it has that sort of impact. I want people to read it and sit, have it be able to, take up space in their mind rent free for as long as possible.
Put the old okey doke on me.
I did-
I'm not interested in good poems. I'm interested in the great ones.
so because I think it's really easy to write. Well, not like really easy,
It's
but
really
I
easy
think
to
I
write good
think
poems,
I
not
think
great
it's very
poems.
possible to write a good poem that doesn't have stakes. But I think it's very hard to write a poem that someone comes back to that doesn't have stakes.
That's fair. No, I agree with that.
And I think again, like it's just again, it's just such a simple question to ask. Like something happens in your poem, and you're just like, so what? Who cares?
Because I don't.
because I don't. I just
Not me.
I just
big big
don't.
surprise, breaking news, shocking news. I hated it.
So and like it's so because there were poems again I brought to workshops, and this again was particularly at Callaloo. And the poems themselves well crafted, based on feedback I was getting, but missing out on that question. There's no
Mm.
reason to return back to the piece. Like, oh, that was nice. That was nice to read. You ever read that poem? Like, you read a poem, you're like, oh, that was nice. I like that poem. That was nice. And then like you never come back to it because there's just nothing really to draw you in. I think stakes are the way that you break free from that. I think stakes are the big unlock.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I think that there's a if you think about a good protagonist, if you think about somebody who, and like when I say a good protagonist, I mean a good protagonist is in a story is whoever it is that's primarily driving the plot, right?
Hmm.
Like that is the person who the writer of the story is pushing the plot through. So their decisions are the ones that, if the protagonist goes left or right, then if there's a fork in the road and there's left or right, then the story happens whichever direction that the protagonist goes through. And as a writer, you really clearly defining the the role and the rules around, what happens because of this character's decisions, like that is how you get investment
Hmm.
as a reader. And that's the reason why, if you have like a show, or if you have a movie, or if you have like a piece of content that you're watching, and the characters that you clearly define stakes in your show or your movie or whatever the content is, and in this case a poem, if you clearly define stakes that your characters break or disregard, then it also it creates a flimsy, like
Hmm.
right, it
Hmm.
creates flimsy writing, because your goal is to be like, the to create the continuity that really impresses
Hmm.
upon those stakes in your poem.
Hmm.
Is I mean, it should be one of the goals, if not
Hmm.
the primary goal.
Yeah.
But again, I'm just saying that that's like the game changer, but it's also like the metaphor is one of the tools that you can use to accomplish it. And I just think
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
there are absolutely people that kind of have that already ingrained in them. I think,
There
yeah,
are.
I think tone is something that, is kind of a characteristic of writers. You can learn it, absolutely, you know what I mean? But like I think there's a lot of writers who already have like kind of the stories in their head that are like, this is how, like, this story isn't even interesting to me
Hmm.
if there aren't stakes here, if
Hmm.
there aren't things I can that I will gain and lose depending
Hmm.
on the situation or the scenario.
Hmm.
But yeah.
Hmm. Similar concept to that. It wasn't when I was doing the poll. You only have four options. Um, Another option I was considering adding was a turn,
Mm,
um, which I decided to use stakes instead because I feel like turns are often connected to stakes to a degree. And I think that if your goal, I'm approaching this from a very academic mindset with poetry. I'm approaching this from someone interested in submitting to especially like tier one type journals, like your poetry mag, your Kenyon review type journals.
yeah,
And the reality is there is a code, and you can get poems published there by breaking the code and things like that. But the reality is that most poems that you're going to find in those journals, if you read them, one, they're going to have stakes.
for sure.
Two, they're going to have a turn. Almost always going to have a turn. And it's pretty predictable about where that turn. I've actually read some poems kind of like making fun of that. But typically your turn's going to be in the last third. Because if it's right in the middle, that's too soon. And if it's like in the first stanza, that's also way too early. It's typically, and then if you have it in your very last stanza, that's too late. So usually it's right around that kind of like lower third mark is usually where you see the turn, and that's also tied into stakes. And that's also something that a lot of my earlier poems were definitely missing out on. It wasn't even something that was on my radar.
Mm,
Um, but that's, I mean, it's similar. You see it in songs with like the bridge. You see it in movies with like the climax and things like that. Poems at that if you're approaching poetry from that sort of mindset that like I want to get into these sorts of journals, then it's pretty much assumed that you're going to have a turn somewhere.
I think that when you're writing I mean, actually, I don't want to say, I take it back. 'Cause I don't think that's everybody. I think that in the open mic poetry culture,
Mhm.
so maybe it's a little
It's a
bit
little, it's
different.
a little different.
It's a little bit different.
It's
It's a
a
little
little
bit
different.
different.
We've been there, yeah.
But there's a lot of rooms that I mean, Columbus that we came up in that, afterwards, after the show, you're kind of having discussions. And actually, I'll never forget it. Um, it was after a show. This guy, I mean, he seemed like a pretty good guy. I can't remember his name. But after the show, he was like asking people what they thought about his poem, and he was like
Very
really interested.
brave. Ooh.
But don't
He
do
didn't
it.
talk to me.
Like, don't
He
volunteer
didn't
that.
talk to
Like,
me.
you know what I'm saying? Like, especially if you're not like, actually, I take that back. I mean, because I think this was a good experience for him. But I just remember Scott being like, I don't
Scott was in
remember your
Columbus.
poem. Scott, yeah, Scott, shout out to Scott Woods. But he remember like, I don't necessarily recall your poem. And the thing is, it's like, if like, do you remember? And he was like asking. So yeah, I asked him like, do you remember his poem? He's
Mhm.
like, yeah, I remember your poem because it did this. And he was like asking like a couple of people like, do you remember their poems? I was like, so what is the thing that you think, you know,
Yep.
like that's what you should really like be thinking about, because it's like, regardless if it was good or bad, like the worst thing that it could be is not even memorized. Like, like,
Yeah.
I don't even remember this
Mhm.
experience of you saying poems to me. So which I think that there's a lot of things that kind of contribute to your poem being memorable. And I think
Yeah.
as people, we are really, really, really attracted to like narrative based devices. Like, if
Yes.
you can give us, because it also helps us kind of organize the lessons that we're learning in the poem. So I think the one of the problems with poems that are just super preachy and they don't really have any any fluid narrative that you can actually like, okay, I don't want to learn from your preachiness. I want to, maybe I learn the same lesson that you're trying to just tell me,
Mhm.
but you're showing me the lesson so I can put
Mhm.
it together myself. I remember him explaining his poem to us after the show, trying to be like, "This is
Mhm.
my poem," and like, "This is what it is." And to me, it was just like, "Oh, like, what was your poem about?" And the poem that the what his poem was about is trying to tell people something
Mhm.
like specific. Like, I'm trying to tell people that you need to do this, and I'm like, okay, but why? Like, what is the why? Because I don't
Mhm.
understand the stakes. I don't understand anything. I just know that you're telling me this over and over again in your poem, and there's ways to accomplish that without stakes, but you have to do other things. Like, comedy is a huge way to, and even with
Mhm.
comedy, you kind of need some stakes in order to be truly funny. But yeah, there's a lot of ways that you can kind of accomplish that. But yeah, yeah,
I think it's really interesting that you don't remember the poem, but you remember the situation after the poem. Again, because of the in a lot of ways, because of the emotion that he was feeling. You're able to put yourself back into that situation because you remember how he was feeling. He was curious about his work, so there's this sense of like curiosity, confusion, maybe even a little bit of sadness on his part to be like, man, oh, no one actually
yeah.
remembers my stuff.
And it was also kind of a realization meeting the expectation. You know
So
what I
there
mean?
was a turn.
It was a
There
turn,
was a turn.
because I think he kind. And the thing is, and again, this is like when we're kind of talking to like when you first start doing poems, there is an inclination for a lot of people when they first start doing poems to, you know, and you see it all the time. You see people that have never performed their poems in front of people ever, right? But they have this idea that they're great writers. They're
Mhm.
like, I just know I'm an incredible writer, and I just need to get out there and do it. And the thing that I'm trying to tell you is that like, there's
Mhm.
going to be a very small amount of people that are like, okay, this is my first time ever performing poems in front of everybody, and my poems are transcendent. You know what I mean? Like, that
Ooh.
might be like the prodigy
Mhm.
poets out there. And the thing, there are some, right? So it's not to say that doesn't exist, but I'm like, the higher likelihood is that, your first time performing oh my god, the first time I performed a poem at writer's block, it was a literal rap. And I can't even tell you how crazy it was. I think after you know, it's so funny because I vividly remember being like, man, nobody's rhyming in their poems. I'm about to blow them away.
Mhm.
They have no idea that y'all
They
can,
don't know what
y'all
they in
know,
for.
like, y'all know y'all can rhyme in these. Oh man, y'all have no idea. And I get up there, and you know what's so interesting? I can't remember the poem. I mean, this might be the point,
Mhm,
but I can't remember the poem. But I do remember like it wasn't there. There was no narrative base in the poem.
mhm.
It was just some catchy little rhymes here and there. And I vividly remember kind of getting up there, getting off of there and being like, yeah,
Yep.
did that. And then afterwards, and I didn't go around asking people or whatever like that, but I think that I was like, you know, I was like, man, nobody else did what I did, but like I loved a lot of other people's poems. I was like, man, that was crazy. That was great. That was great. And I rapped up there and I can't even remember the poem. I can't remember. And I remember like that just being a whole thing for me. Which is all just to say that I think that at my core base level is like I love telling stories. I like writing stories.
Mhm.
And but I didn't translate that to what was happening on stage because I thought poetry was something specific.
Yeah.
And I the thing is like I was probably doing that into some degree in other spaces, but I thought it was this thing where I'm like, I'm supposed to be up there rhyming and rapping and being cool. So I was also like, man, all these people in here, like most of everybody in there was white, right? So I'm over thinking like, they don't even know how to rap. They have no idea. Oh man, I'm about to shock their system with these bars, and I I was not doing that. You're not right now who you're probably going to be as an artist in a year. And I would not try to hold on to what you're doing right
Mm.
now. I think a lot of people have a very um tight-fisted devotion to exactly who they are as a
Tight
writer.
fist. Yeah.
And I'm like, you should be open to the development of your art through the development of your person. So like let
Oh,
your art let your art be, you know, whatever representation of you that's out there, because I think a lot of poets, they kind of what would they kind of typecast themselves.